Hey everybody, John Wagon here with DevCentral. We're coming to you with another Lightboard lesson. And today we're going to talk about a couple of different vulnerabilities that have been hot and have affected lots and lots of people. They are Spectre and Meltdown. These are interesting vulnerabilities because they're not really dependent upon software, but they're actually targeted at hardware, like the actual processor of your computer. And the first one we'll talk about is the Spectre. So Spectre, I'm going to write it up here, S-P-E-C-T-R-E. I looked up the definition for Spectre. It's like a ghost or like this really scary thing that like no one can control. And actually the reason that this thing is named Spectre is, frankly, there's not a lot of great mitigation actions to be able to handle this thing. So it's going to be around for a while. But nonetheless, even though it's going to be around for a while, we still need to understand kind of what it's doing and how it works. All right, I would say that the entirety of the Spectre vulnerability lies in the fact that a modern processor wants to execute instructions as fast and efficiently as possible. So because of that, sometimes when you have memory and processor and all that going on, the memory that is required to let the processor know, hey, here's the results of an instruction, that kind of thing, the memory may be tied up, and then the processor, instead of waiting on the memory to be available, it's going to go ahead and execute even more instructions. So let's just say, for example, you have an instruction, x plus 1 equals y, and then the next one maybe, y plus 2 equals, z or something like that. Well, if x plus 1 equals y, if y is not able to be calculated just yet because you're waiting on a memory address space, then what the processor may do is what's called speculative instructions or speculative execution, where it'll say, hey, I'm going to guess the value of y because I think I know what it might be, and I'm going to go ahead and execute this instruction also. So when it does that, there's a couple of different terms to keep in mind as well, and they are discard, so discard and commit, C-O-M-M-I-T. Okay, so discard, that's not a good D. All right, discard and commit. What happens is, if a processor is, say, executing this instruction right here, x plus 1 equals y, and the memory space that would take up the value for y, or that would hold the value for y, if that's being held by some other process right now, and it's not available yet, and then it goes ahead and speculates the value for y and it executes this, then what's going to happen is once the memory space that holds the value for y, once that's available, then the processor will now come back and say, was this speculative execution correct or not? And if it was correct, then it will commit that value for z into memory. If it was not correct, then it will discard that, and then it will execute the correct instruction based on the correct value for y. So that's what this speculative execution does. The reason that that's a really cool thing is that speeds up the processor speed like crazy huge. And so everyone loves that. They're like, hey, my processor's all totally fast now. It's like 10 times faster than it used to be. Because some could argue, well, just wait for the value of y to be processed and then do this instruction. Well, if you do that, your processor speed is going to go way, way down. All right, so that's what it does. So it either discards or commits based on the true value of what was the speculative execution. All right, so the way that Spectre works is you have this bad guy that comes into the equation, and he says, all right, I'm going to throw some values in with some very detailed or some very targeted instructions that I know that the processor is going to execute. And I'm going to send it certain instructions, and then when it speculatively executes those, then I'm going to have this covert channel that is listening to that, and it's going to effectively leak the memory of this computer out to the bad guy. All right, so to kind of break it down, just a really quick thing. Let's say that you have a set of instructions like this. Let's say you have an if statement. If x is less than, I'm going to say array 1, then y equals array array 2 sub array of x. All right, like that. Okay, so basically what's happening here is if you have an x value that is less than the value of this array 1, then you're going to set a value for y in another array that is that all this nested stuff. But basically, the value for x is going to effectively or ultimately be put into this value for this other array. So what can happen is you've got an attacker that's going to send first of all, the attacker is going to understand that this set of instructions creates speculative execution, and they've done that kind of beforehand. What the attacker is going to do is he's going to send in a bunch of values for x. So I'll say value x, and I'm going to put a check mark. It's good because at first they're going to start to essentially train the processor and say, all right, first value for x is less than array 1, and so it's going to kick off this instruction right here, and it's going to set the value for y based on the value that they've put in for x. So then they do that several times, and so what the processor starts to do is it starts to say, okay, I understand now that this value of x is typically less than array 1, and so I can go ahead and do this next instruction. But then what the attacker does is they send in a malicious value x into this, and it's actually greater than array 1, and because they're bad guys and they're like, hey, we're going to throw a curveball at you. Well, what the processor is going to do is it's going to speculatively execute this instruction still, but it's going to use the value that it was given for x, and even though x is now greater than, this malicious value x is greater than array 1, it's still going to kick this instruction off right here, and it's going to put that malicious value x into this array, and it's going to set that into memory, and the malicious guy, the attacker, is going to be waiting for that to happen and is going to be looking at that memory space, and as soon as that memory space gets allocated and gets used up, then it's going to know, hey, this has executed into the bad guy value for x space, and it's going to have that's basically going to create a covert channel back to allow them to see the contents of the memory. All right. Now, what's going to end up happening is the processor back here is going to figure out later that, hey, that was a bad value for x, and I need to discard that. But at that point, it's too late. The memory's already been leaked, and the bad guy has the memory. So effectively, what can happen is you can read the memory of the machine. This actually is a problem for processors today, and I'll put Intel, I'll put AMD, and then I'll put ARM. All right, so all of these processor types are vulnerable to this, so it's a big deal. Okay, so that's the Spectre vulnerability. I'm going to go through Meltdown really quick. Meltdown is another processor or hardware vulnerability, and that basically takes a similar type thing where it uses the fact that a processor is going to over-execute, or in this case, execute out of order instructions, and it's going to take advantage of that in order to be able to read memory. So let's say you have memory like this. I'll just put, if this is the memory on your computer, all right, I'm going to put a little line right here, and let's say this is, this is I'm going to call it protected memory, protected. This would be like kernel memory space, and then I'll call this, typical user memory space, all right? What can happen here is a malicious bad guy can send instructions to the processor to say, hey, I need you to access this protected memory, but the protected memory is shielded from typical user activity. So if you're a user on the computer, you should not be able to access this protected memory in the computer. So because it's protected or because it's shielded, the typical user should not be able to get into it. But because the processor will actually do instructions out of order, what can happen is a malicious bad guy, a user can send instructions, and these are targeted instructions again, to the processor to say, hey, I want you to access the protected memory of the system, and and basically because the bad guy can trick the processor into doing instructions out of order, then the processor will actually execute the instructions on the protected memory space, and before it can realize, hey, I just process these instructions on protected memory, I need to not do that. I need to go back. Then again, it's too late, and then that protected memory can be dumped. So the physical memory, I'll put all the physical memory can be completely accessed on this computer. All right, the reason that this is called Meltdown is because you have this idea of all of the memory on the computer, some of it's user and then some of it's protected, and there's supposed to be these effectively these walls, these guards between these two different types of memory. And because of this problem, then these walls have been melted down, and so now there's no distinction between user, like common user, and protected memory. All right, so this thing is specifically problematic for the Intel processors, which there are Intel processors all over the world. So anyway. So again, this one uses out-of-order instructions for an attacker to go after protected memory in order to be able to dump all the memory off of a computer. This one right here uses these speculative instructions where a computer is going to say, hey, I think this instruction needs to be run based on what I think this value is on the previous instruction. Either way, all the memory gets dumped, and you can imagine there are lots and lots of values in your memory that you would not want to be dumped to a bad guy. Alrighty. There's a guy named Daniel Meisler, I believe is how you pronounce his name. I'll copy or I'll link to his stuff on here. He has a really good kind of a matrix that shows the meltdown or the meltdown problem and the Spectre problem, and then who it affects and the entry methods and the impact and the actions. Which, by the way, there are some software patches that can be run to help with this. I won't say that they're completely effective, but they're better than nothing. So if you have a software patch, whether you're Windows or Mac OS or Linux or whatever, make sure you put that in there. So all right. So again, we just want to go over Meltdown, Spectre. It's hot right now. It's big. It's important. And so I hope you've learned a couple things here today, and we'll see you guys out there in the community.